Hello, everyone. My name is Georgia Meade, and this is Discerning and Living the Label, a comparative study of sexual identity recognition and expression in heterosexually and non-heterosexually identified individuals. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be referring to heterosexually identified individuals as straight and non-heterosexually identified individuals as queer. So first, I'd like to present my research questions for the study, which are how sexuality impacts the age at which an individual first recognizes or identifies their sexuality, how sexuality impacts the age at which an individual first feels comfortable expressing their sexuality, and how race affects the age for each category, considering both race and the intersections of race with these categories. So what do we know in the literature? We know that heteronormative societies value and reward heterosexuality over other sexual identities. They assume that heterosexuality is both natural and normative. We would consider American society as well heteronormative. We know that LGBTQ individuals face invalidation when coming out, regardless of parental acceptance. This goes across all racial and ethnic categories, and coming out is a difficult process in a heteronormative society where, again, heterosexuality is both assumed and accepted. We know that white LGBTQ teenagers are the most likely to identify as queer out of all racial groups, given that the intersection of both normative racial categories and heteronormativity are at play. We know that queerness is considered less normative for people of color. So for the methods of the study, we conducted 16 semi-structured interviews of both straight and queer individuals. I performed both quantitative and qualitative data analysis, with the quantitative data analysis including the mean or average of the data and the median or middle of the data. Qualitative analysis included participant responses, which will be shown as quotes throughout the presentation, as well as sociological commentary. I've included demographic information on this slide with useful context about race and sexuality. This demographic information will also be spread throughout the presentation. In the data for the age that individuals first recognized or identified their sexuality, I found that queer individuals took the longest to recognize their sexuality regardless of race. It is notable, however, that that straight people of color recognized that they were straight before their white counterparts. As well, I've highlighted this median of 0.0 here in particular, given that this value suggests that always, or showing that individuals never had any doubt that their sexuality was straight, was the most common response. 2 of the 3 individuals in this category responded with always, which is a value that I coded as 0 quantitatively. With queer people of color being the latest to recognize their sexuality, I have a quote here from interview 8, which describes a mixed race queer woman's experience with recognizing her sexuality, in which she describes the process as kind of late. We know that especially in the years when our subjects were children, LGBTQ people of color were underrepresented in the media. For example, in 2013, only about 3.3% of regularly seen characters in primetime scripted shows were LGBT. Only 28% of that 3.3% were people of color. We know this trend is changing. However, the average age of our subjects was about 22 for queer subjects and 25.9 for straight subjects, respectively. So this trend would have been present when our subjects were children. Also, we know that, again, from the literature, white LGBTQ teenagers are the most likely to identify as queer, and queerness is seen as less normative for people of color. I also found that straight people of color recognized or identified their sexuality at earlier ages than straight white people. This is likely because people of color and women of color in particular are sexualized by society. So they are socialized or taught by society to consider sexuality as a part of their racial and gender identities. I mentioned women of color in particular because out of our 16-person sample, 11 were women and 6 of those women were women of color. Particularly for Black women, earlier puberty means earlier expectations and discussions of sex and sexuality as well. We know that Black sexuality is constructed under the hypersexual stereotype, suggesting that Black women are overly sexual as compared to other racial categories. These stereotypes continue to persist and have existed for many generations. We know as well that girls self-survey and self-sexualize their bodies at similar rates across racial categories. However, Black girls, due to the hypersexual stereotypes, might be more severely impacted with increased rates of depression and hostility. In the data for the age that individuals first felt comfortable expressing their sexuality, I found that again, regardless of race, queer individuals took longer to express their sexuality than their straight peers. I've highlighted for similar reasons the median here of 0 for straight white individuals, because the majority of individuals in this category responded with always, suggesting they had always felt comfortable expressing their sexuality and had never had difficulty or concerns with expressing their sexuality. I again have coded the response of always as 0. The data here did have a range of from 0 to 16.5. However, 0 was the most common response. It is notable, however, that straight white people felt comfortable expressing their sexuality before they recognized it, at an average age of about 6. Going back to the idea of a heteronormative society, we know that parents both expect and accept their children as heterosexual. This is a reason why always was such a common response for straight white individuals. We know that feeling understood by family plays a very important role in the development of self-esteem, and this goes for both straight and queer individuals. Queer individuals, however, might prefer to be accepted by their family rather than understood, and thus not feel comfortable expressing their sexuality around their family. Particularly if you're queer men as well, parents tend to have difficulty educating their sons on sex, and the sex education that they provide tends to be heteronormative. Queer men also receive heteronormative sex education from other sources, such as their peers and their schooling, which may make them uncomfortable expressing their sexuality as well. I also found that queer people of color felt comfortable expressing their sexuality earlier than white queer people. We know that being out or generally being comfortable with their sexuality tends to have positive psychological effects based on indicators of well-being on all racial and ethnic groups, as does access to community. And coming out can be a way to access and find this community. We also know that microaggressions against people of color who are part of the LGBT community may be related to depression and the increase in perceived stress. So by coming out and finding community, one can alleviate this stress. I would like to conclude by summarizing that individuals across both categories of sexual identity recognition and expression recognized their queerness later than heterosexual. I did find unexpected racial differences in both questions, particularly for straight people of color, but for people of color in general. This study is limited by its small sample size of only 16, as well as the semi-structured interview style that meant that only the majority, but not all of participants were asked all of the questions, and certain responses given couldn't be coded into quantitative values. Further research should examine racial differences in greater detail using specific racial categories. Our sample was simply too small to meaningfully achieve this. I would like to thank these individuals as well as many more who could not be listed here. If you have any questions, my email is on the screen. Please feel free to contact me about this research. And here are my references. Thank you all so much.